atrocities did not precede, but followed the bombing, as the indictment of Milosevic has also revealed. That could hardly have come as a surprise. The violence was predicted by NATO Commander Wesley Clark as soon as the bombing began, quite publicly. Other sources make clear that the Clinton administration also anticipated the crimes that followed the bombing, as Clark confirms in more detail in his memoirs. It is hard to imagine that other NATO authorities were more deluded. In the extensive literature on the topic, from media to scholarship, this documentation is almost universally ignored and the chronology reversed. I have reviewed the dismal record elsewhere, and will put it aside here, with only a few current examples to illustrate the effect of consistent fabrication in support of state power and the systematic refusal even to look at unwanted fact, however trusted the source. Former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci writes that NATO bombed after Milosevic embarked on an ethnic cleansing operation and other atrocities. The inversion of chronology is typical. It is uncontroversial that the atrocities he describes were the anticipated consequence of the bombing, not its cause. Historian Niall Ferguson states, without evidence, that there was a plausible ground for intervention to avert genocide. David Rieff presents what he calls evidence. According to both German intelligence officials and Greek diplomats, the Belgrade authorities had always intended to deport a large number of Kosovars. The usual figure was 350,000. Even if Rieff's unidentified sources exist, they would be meaningless. To discover that Belgrade had contingency plans to expel Kosovars, we do not have to adduce unknown officials and diplomats. It would have been astonishing had they not had such plans, as other states do, including the enlightened states. It is an extraordinary comment on Western intellectual culture that people can take seriously someone who adduces such reasons to justify his own state's carrying out aggression that, as he himself acknowledges, led to the forcible deportation of some 800,000 Kosovars, among other atrocities. Crossing the Atlantic, Karl-Heinz Kamp of the Adenauer Foundation criticizes the December 2004 UN panel because it rejected NATO's right to resort to force in violation of the Charter. He cites one example, the usual one, the NATO bombing of Serbia, which was undertaken, he asserts, without evidence, because NATO placed a higher value on the protection of human rights than on obedience to the Charter, namely by bombing with the expectation that so doing would elicit massive human rights violations, as it did. Some of the examples descend to low comedy. Thus, to illustrate the highbrow anti-Americanism that reigns beyond our shores, commentator James Traub takes as his example the Nobel Prize, awarded in 2005 to playwright Harold Pinter, whose politics are so extreme that they're almost impossible to parody. The proof is Pinter's outrage over NATO's 1999 air war in Kosovo, which, according to Traub, he described as a criminal act designed to consolidate American domination of Europe. All right-thinking people, Traub explains, know that the bombing was essentially a last resort in the face of Slobodan Milosevic's savage campaign of ethnic cleansing. While such crazed ideas flourish among European highbrows, Traub continues, within our more sober intellectual culture, it is hard to think of anyone, save Noam Chomsky and Gore Vidal, who would not choke on Pinter's bile. It is actually not so hard to think of others. One choice would be the only American author, to my knowledge, who has actually taken the position so extreme that it is impossible to parody, the respected academic military historian Andrew Bacevich, author of a well-known book in which he dismissed the pretense of humanitarian motive for the Kosovo War or the Bosnia intervention, charging that they were undertaken solely to ensure the cohesion of NATO and the credibility of American power, and to sustain American primacy in Europe. Among others who might not choke are those who have not been content with propaganda so vulgar that it was even refuted by the daily press reports at the time, and who may even have taken the trouble to look at the massive official documentation on the chronology of the bombing and ethnic cleansing, which reveals conclusively that the truth is precisely the opposite of Traub's anguished lament. Though the facts are uncontroversial, they are clearly irrelevant, for reasons that Traub rightly explains. It is impossible to dissuade implacable ideologues, any more than you can an implacable jihadist. Justice Goldstone is unusual in that he does recognize the facts. In his words, the direct result of the bombing was that almost 1 million people fled Kosovo into neighboring countries, and about 500,000 people were displaced within Kosovo itself, a tremendous catastrophe for the people of Kosovo, compounded by serious crimes under Western military occupation afterward. Reviewing the anticipated consequences of the bombing, Justice Goldstone adds that supporters of the war had to console themselves with the belief that Operation Horseshoe, the Serb plan of ethnic cleansing directed against the Albanians in Kosovo, had been set in motion before the bombing. That is small consolation, however. The rich Western documentary record reveals no significant changes in Serbian practices before the bombing was announced and the monitors withdrawn, and makes it clear that the major atrocities, including expulsion, began later. As for Operation Horseshoe, Wesley Clark reported several weeks after the bombing that he knew nothing about it. Publicized by NATO powers after the shocking effects of the bombing were evident, it was long ago exposed as a probable intelligence fabrication. In fact, it is rather odd that it continues to be cited in scholarship and journalism, since there is no need to fabricate. As mentioned, it can hardly be doubted that Serbia had such contingency plans in the event of a NATO attack, just as Israel surely has contingency plans to expel the Palestinian population in some emergency. As for U.S. contingency plans, those we know of are utterly shocking, and one hardly expects others to be particularly gentle. Kosovo was an ugly place before the NATO bombing, though regrettably not by international standards. According to Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed on all sides in the year prior to the invasion, many by the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, guerrillas, attacking Serbs from Albania in an effort, as they openly stated, to elicit a harsh Serbian response that could rally Western opinion to their cause. The British government makes the remarkable claim that up until January 1999, most of the 2,000 were killed by the KLA, and Western sources consistently report that there was no significant change until the NATO war was announced and implemented. One of the few serious scholarly studies even to pay attention to these matters estimates that Serbs were responsible for 500 of the 2,000 killed. This is the careful and judicious study by Nicholas Wheeler, who supports the NATO bombing on the grounds that there would have been worse atrocities if NATO had not bombed. The fact that these are the strongest arguments that can be contrived by serious analysts tells us a good deal about the decision to bomb, particularly when we recall that there were diplomatic options. It is perhaps worth mentioning an astonishing justification for the bombing contrived by some of its supporters, though not put forth by British and American authorities, that the NATO attack was justified by the crimes at Srebrenica, or Bosnia generally. Suppose we try to take the argument seriously. If we do, it is easy to show that the same humanitarians should have been calling even more stridently for the bombing of Washington and London. To mention just the most obvious reason, as the war drums were beating over Kosovo in early 1999, Indonesia began to escalate its crimes in East Timor. Its record in early 1999 was far more criminal than anything reported from Kosovo, even putting aside the fact that this was illegally occupied territory. Furthermore, the Indonesian